Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. For all of the returning listeners and subscribers and our very valued patrons, thank you so much for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It goes a very long way in promoting the channel. And don't forget, if you already don't know, if you don't know already, I don't know what I'm saying. Next month, we'll be doing a live podcast in the city where I left my heart, San Francisco. Hey, April 17th, Ben Burgess and I will be at the El Rio in the Mission District doing a live podcast. The subject is Trump, the end of history. Wherever you are watching or listening to this episode, there is a ticket link in the description. I look forward to seeing y'all there. Also, tonight we'll be going to the Champagne Room. Will Derek Varn join us in the Champagne Room? I don't know. Will he join us in the main show? I don't know. Maybe. But today, there is someone that is here for sure, and that is historian and political analyst, extremely valued member of the TIR Comintern, Djene Bajalan. Today we look to explore the complexities surrounding the potential end of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known as the PKK. Emerging in the 1970s as a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla movement committed to Kurdish liberation from Turkish state repression, the PKK has evolved ideologically and tactically over the decades. Its shift from a vision of an independent Kurdish state to a project rooted in Abdullah Ocalan's framework of democratic confederalism has captured the imagination of leftists globally, particularly through the autonomous structures established in Rojava, northern Syria. However, the PKK now faces existential challenges. Ocalan has called for the PKK to be disbanded. What does that mean for the fight for a Kurdish state? Between Turkish military aggression, shifting geopolitics in the region, and internal fragmentation, many wonder if the PKK's struggle as we know it is nearing its conclusion. As global powers realign and local forces reassert control, what does this mean for the future of Kurdish self-determination and the broader leftist struggle in the Middle East? Djene Bajalan brings a deep historical lens to these questions, helping us untangle the complex realities that define the PKK's past, present, and the possible future. Please welcome someone I am very honored to call a friend, Djene Bajalan.
Hello, Jason Miles, and hello, TIR listeners. What do we call TIR listeners?
It's a busy night in the Bajalan house, so I appreciate you taking some time to step away from daddy duties to talk about something that I don't want to say just near and dear to your heart, but is this part of your political study as well as just who you are as a man?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, like I've worked on these topics before, and I don't specialize in the history of the PKK, but it's pretty important when you study Kurdish history as one of the kind of biggest political movements to emerge during this period.
The first time you were on this show, I guess it was 4 years ago. No, these are 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a while since your first appearance on this show. It was when your hair was short for real the first time, I believe.
2020, I think we first started hooking up.
Oh, I think it was 2020, so maybe like 5 years ago. You talked about the Kurdish people.
The Kurdish people, yes, I did.
I don't want to mess up. I don't know if you remember. It was by messing up the regions that created Iraqistan.
Iraqistan, yeah. That's where... deep in the TIR lore.
Only real TIR fans know
about Iraqistan.
The Iraqistan freedom movement.
The Iraqistan. We even had a poster for the Iraqistan freedom movement. The Iraqistan Liberation Front.
The Iraqistan Liberation Army. But can you explain the geopolitical conditions of the 70s that shaped the emergence of the PKK?
Yeah, sure. So, after the First World War, the you got it. The Kurdish territory, the regions of the Middle East where the majority of the Kurdish population lived, were kind of repartitioned prior to the First World War. Part of it was in Iran, the Qajar Empire. Part of it was in the Ottoman Empire. After the First World War, obviously, the Ottoman Empire was partitioned, and we had the Kurdish population found themselves now divided between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and also Iran. So you have this new state of affairs. Now, during the Turkish War of Independence, the founding moment of the Republic, the initial ideology of the kind of revolutionary movement was a kind of multicultural Islamic community. So, early Turkey was very hostile towards Christian populations, but in terms of its official ideology, at least during the very early 1920s, when this movement began, was a kind of cosmopolitan Muslim identity that, everybody remaining in the remaining Ottoman territories were Muslims, Kurds, Turks, Circassians, Bosniaks, all these people, kind of multicultural thing. However, once the Turkish Republic was founded, and established, the wars, against Greece, against the Armenians, the conflicts with Britain, once they were resolved, the Turkish state moved towards a kind of more ethno-nationalist form of nationalism. I wouldn't say it's absolutely a kind of ethnic nationalism, but one byproduct of that was you had a very harsh repression of not just, Kurdish rebels or Kurdish political leaders, but of Kurdish culture, way of life, language, etc., more generally. And obviously that bred resentment. And in the 1920s and 1930s, you have several major Kurdish uprisings, usually kind of led by an alliance of kind of westernized intellectuals and tribal leaders who, for differing reasons, had become alienated from the Turkish state. However, the Turkish state by the late 1930s had been quite successful in suppressing these movements militarily. So you had three major uprisings: the Sheikh Said Revolt in 1925, the Ararat Revolt in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and then finally the Dersim Revolt in the mid to late 1930s. These revolts were repressed very violently. Populations were, villages were destroyed. Populations were exiled from their homelands as well. But it wasn't just repression. The Turkish state also adopted a kind of friendlier posture towards tribal political elites, many of whom had been rebelling against the state. So what we see by the 40s and 50s is, the Kurdish area of the country is kind of more or less quiet. The Turkish state makes these kind of bargains with local tribal leaders, many of whom, adopt Turkish language and culture and move to Ararat. They become absentee landlords, etc., etc. So you have the kind of end of this first phase. But then in the 1960s, there's a lot of modernization, social change, rural to urban migrations. And this gives rise to a kind of new wave of Kurdish political activism. And this new wave of Kurdish political activism in the 60s and 70s was divided not between, for example, those who wanted to maybe just autonomy within Turkey and those who wanted independence, but rather between those who saw the road to Kurdish liberation as being achievable through socialist revolution. So many Kurds became attached themselves to leftist movements in Turkey, and then more conservative elements, some elements of the landowning class, etc., attempted to kind of improve the situation of Kurds through constitutional, legal, and parliamentary means. For example, trying to get more resources spent in the east of the country, in the Kurdish regions of the country. You had this movement called, this ideology, Doğuculuk, Eastism, an idea that, hey, to solve this problem, it's just a problem of modernization. Let's modernize the region. Let's kind of provide goods and services, etc. So, in the 60s and 70s, this is obviously an oversimplification. A division within the Kurdish movement not over the question of independence. People, aren't really pushing for full independence, but rather, will there be a socialist revolution to solve this problem, or can it be resolved through the institutions of the Turkish Republic, the parliament, et cetera, et cetera. However, the 60s and 70s is a very turbulent time in Turkey. So we see, the kind of Eastism, the constitutionalists, they kind of aren't very successful in getting, ameliorating the Kurdish community's position. There's still a lot of cultural repression, etc. You have these periodic military coups in the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s, which often leads to trials and the repression of Kurdish intellectuals. And of course, more generally, you get the repression of the left in Turkey. Let's say the moderate socialists that seek to work within the Turkish political system are kind of repressed by the end of the 70s. And you have like a fragmentation of the Turkish left. And in this kind of chaotic milieu in the 1970s, this is where Öcalan, kind of comes up. There's like a wave of left-wing Kurdish political activism. There are new organizations that come into being. And the PKK is one of these organizations. And in fact, it's a very extreme organization in the late 1970s. And also one that is, initially, at least during the late 1970s, its targets are not so much the Turkish state. It doesn't really start targeting the Turkish state until 1984. But in the late 70s, its main targets are Kurdish landowners and tribal elites, many of whom have close connections with the Turkish state, and also other Kurdish political parties. So, for example, the PKK attacks another major Kurdish political party called the PSK, the Socialist Party of Kurdistan. And the PKK, from its inception, adopts this kind of very maximalist political program. So whereas previous Kurdish political movement in Turkey had sought to resolve the question within the existing international frontiers of the country, for example, the Socialist Party of Kurdistan kind of pushed for some form of autonomy or local government in Turkey. The PKK adopts this maximalist political program. It calls for a united, independent Kurdistan. So not only does it seek independence from Turkey for the Kurdish regions of Turkey, but it lays claim to the whole of the Kurdish region across the Middle East, claiming to be a party for, the whole of Kurdistan, so pushing for the unification of Iraqi Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan, Syrian Kurdistan, although that sort of changes a little bit, and I'll come to that in a moment, and Turkish Kurdistan, this united socialist Kurdistan. So very much the kind of anti-colonial, Maoist, Marxist-Leninist, traditional political party. It's a very violent political party as well. Like I said, many of its actions are not only directed against the Turkish state, but those elements of Kurdish society that they regard as being collaborationalists. And one of the things that really propels the PKK to political prominence during the 1980s, when the insurgency really begins, is the 1980 military coup in Turkey. So, I don't need to digress too much about this coup, but you have a kind of, let's say, a Pinochet-esque coup d'etat in Turkey. There's a kind of political deadlock in Turkey. The various political leaders, can't string together. You have weak coalition government.
Is it U.S. sponsored?
The U.S. is kind of involved. The level of U.S. involvement, I've read different things to the extent, but certainly the U.S. didn't mind the coup because the Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit was kind of a moderate social democrat, also a Turkish nationalist. He was the guy who launched the invasion of Cyprus in 1974, but he was seen as being a little bit too close to the Soviet Union, and the country was deteriorating into conflict. Ecevit alienated the left and the union movement. At the same time, you have pogroms orchestrated against religious minorities in Turkey, in particular the Alevi community in Turkey. You have these horrible massacres that take place. So the country's kind of deteriorating into a low-grade civil war in the late 1970s. Student violence, you have the Grey Wolves fighting on the streets, you have Kurdish nationalists, etc., and sort of faced with this chaos, the military steps in to quote unquote provide order. And Turkey is really reordered in 1980, and there's a lot of ways it's reordered. It's the beginning of kind of the neoliberal era in Turkey. You have this like privatization era taking place in the 1980s. But one of the other offshoots is that you have this huge wave of repression. That repression is directed against the left. It is also, to a certain degree, directed against the extreme right. Although very famously, the leader of the Grey Wolves, the kind of ultra-nationalist, Turkish nationalist, even though he's jailed, he says, well, I'm in jail, but my ideas are now the ruling ideas of Turkey. So you have this huge repression of Kurds. And many Kurdish political parties are kind of destroyed by this. But the PKK escapes to Syria. Syria has some territorial disputes with Turkey. So the PKK escaped to Syria and kind of ride out the worst phase of the coup in exile. So a lot of the opposition that they would have within the Kurdish community, other political parties, are wiped out by the coup, wiped out by the repression. And also, Diyarbakir, which is one of the main Kurdish cities in Turkey, Kurdish inhabited cities in Turkey, you have this very famous military prison there where, thousands of people are rounded up and tortured in horrific ways. And this, people who have studied this and said that actually this was one of the biggest recruiting tools for the PKK. So, the PKK have their opposition wiped out by the Turkish state, potential rival political parties, and then you have this brutal repression, which turns many Kurds who, wouldn't necessarily have become radicalized them. A good parallel for those who are familiar with the history of Ireland, you have in the 70s internment without trial in Great Britain, which, many people are kind of scooped up, put in prison. And if they weren't in the IRA when they went into the prison, they were in the IRA when they left. And the Diyarbakir prison, after people who are released from this prison, many of them go to the mountains and join the PKK. And by 1984, the PKK begins this, guerrilla insurgency, very violent, attacking Turkish government, posts, and also again attacking Kurdish groups they see as collaborating. In response, the Turkish government, deports people, villages, burns villages to the ground. Often it's called a dirty war. So you have this extremely violent conflict, and the Turkish state does a lot of human rights abuses, but so does the PKK as well. It would be dishonest for people to paint them as this kind of peace-loving picture that you sometimes get today from people who aren't familiar with the political party. And it was a very centralized and Stalinist type of political party, in which, Öcalan had built this huge cult of personality around himself. Often, successful PKK commanders were often, sent off to their death lest they challenge Öcalan's rule, etc., within the party. Now, by the PKK was kind of a shock for the Turkish state during the 1980s, but by the 1990s, Turkey, armed by the Clintons, huge amounts of arm transfers during the Clinton administration, the Turkish state begins to get the upper hand against the PKK. And of course, you have it's the Turkish state continues to brutally repress the Kurdish community to more generally, there are attempts, especially in the early 90s, for parliamentary, approaches to solving the Kurdish question, but those are kind of don't get off the ground. So you end up with this kind of ongoing conflict. But as the military balance of power begins to shift, by the late 80s, early 90s, the PKK begins to kind of give up its goal of a united socialist independent Kurdistan. So they kind of moderate their position and their demands. And, this was in a certain way this was prefigured by, for example, initially the PKK included Rojava and Syria, parts of Syrian Kurdistan, as part of their political project, but also in order to get support from the Syrian government. The PKK said, actually, no, Syria, Kurds in Syria are just refugees. We don't want have any claims of Syrian on Syrian territory. And this is important because the PKK was based out of Syrian-occupied Lebanon during this period. One of the PKK's first military operations, for example, was against Israel in the Bekaa Valley during the 1980s as well. So, they were this group they were based in Syria. Öcalan was like living in Syrian-occupied Lebanon. Many Syrian Kurds the Syrian government basically, to kind of direct Kurdish political energy away from Damascus, would allow the PKK to recruit from amongst Syrian Kurds. So you have this kind of these cross-border operations going on over time. But by the 90s, the Turkish government is kind of getting a handle on things. And then in 1990, in the late 90s, the Turkish government basically say, look, Syria, if you don't deal with the PKK, if you don't expel them, if you don't get rid of them, we're going to invade. So under that pressure, Syria expels Abdullah Ocalan. He goes to Italy, he goes all around the world with the support of the Greeks. And then, according to numerous sources, with the help of Israel and the United States, Öcalan is captured in Kenya. Was being protected by the Greeks, and he's arrested and brought back, put on trial, placed in jail. And when placed on trial again, he moderates even further, saying that we just want some kind of we don't want independence, but some kind of confederalism, local government, local autonomy, etc., etc. And that's really been the kind of ideology of the PKK, since the 1990s. So, often you'll hear people talk about the PKK as wanting an independent Kurdistan, but really the PKK hasn't advocated for the PKK hasn't really advocated for a united independent Kurdistan since the early 1990s.
Well, let me ask you this about the 90s and not to throw you off. How did the fall of the Soviet Union affect the PKK at all?
Yes, I mean, I think part of the reconsidering of their positions in the 1990s, and even a questioning of their raison d'etre, is the capture, is the fall of the Soviet Union. In Öcalan's sort of statement that was released the other week, he mentions the fall of socialism, and this is not something new that he hasn't said before. There's been, with the kind of fall of the Soviet Union, it led to a kind of identity crisis within the PKK. They shift away from the traditional Marxist-Leninist decolonial style of thinking towards different ways. And, so especially in the 2000s onwards, and under the influence of, thinkers like Murray Bookchin, who's a kind of anarchist, and his influence, I think, is a little bit exaggerated. I think it's a little bit of wish casting by Western anarchists about this. But the PKK.
Why do you say that?
Well, if you go to Kurdistan, nobody's talking. People talking about Öcalan. They aren't talking about Murray Bookchin. I'll tell you that for nothing. But Öcalan kind of. I mean, he writes a bunch of stuff in prison that is kind of published. Just
was it Bookchin-esque, you think? No.
Yeah, like stuff about history, stuff like a whole bunch of kind of historical narratives about Mesopotamia, about women being at the center of the political movement, environmentalism. So, they shift away from traditional Marxist-Leninism to some kind of ideological hodgepodge that has Marxist elements to it, but also incorporates environmentalism, sort of feminist ideas, anarchistic ideas, this concept of municipalism, etc., etc., etc., etc. So that kind of ideological orientation. So it's a kind of like a, it's not a traditional Marxist-Leninist movement anymore. It's we might even call it like a radical liberal political movement.
So you used a term that I also read as I was looking up some information about today. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to, you will forget more about this than I will, be able to learn in the amount of time that I had to prepare for this show. Can you explain confederalism?
Yeah, I mean, democratic confederalism is this kind of idea. It's an idea forwarded by Ocalan, and you have to get into his deep kind of historical understanding to kind of get this. But one of his big criticisms is that the modern states in the Middle East, the modern capitalist order, has sort of bred authoritarianism, a kind of bureaucratic kind of formation. So it's also a critic of what we might call state socialism. And so we have this kind of over-centralized system of government, this over-centralized national identity, and that's the kind of root of oppression. And so instead, the idea is that you can have a kind of a new type of organization or administrative structure, which is democratic and which is on a kind of very on a local level. So you have like local councils that are open to everybody. So a kind of bottom up. A bottom-up form of organizing based on kind of local communes that are organized around, let's say, women's groups, etc., etc. So it's a kind of so the term confederalism, obviously, can be understood as like an institution like the European Union, right?
Okay.
Or like the United States of America before the Constitution was written, right? Where you have a very weak sort of central government and the sovereignty lies in the states, right? Whereas, federalism, you have this like there's a more equal, or even the central federal government is stronger than the states, which have like also have some sovereignty but not absolute. Democratic confederalism is a little bit different from that. It's more this idea of put it very simply, that you have these local bottom-up participatory democracy, right? And that different communities and groups organize together, come together, and build like communes from the bottom up. So it's not your traditional, let's say, it's not your traditional, like, let's say, ethnic autonomy, as it were, in a territorial sense. Ocalan kind of gives up on the idea of a territorial form of autonomy. So, and what I mean by that is where you have, like, let's say, Iraqi Kurdistan, which has its own which has its own parliament, it's like a state-like institution with autonomy under the Iraqi constitution, right? Or a place like Scotland, or one of the states of the United States, or one of the provinces of Canada, like Quebec or something like that. That's not what they kind of give up on that, and they push for like local government, local participatory government, cultural rights, etc., etc. That so there's a kind of shift away from traditional Marxist-Leninism to this kind of, and I would call it kind of a radical liberalism based on kind of almost like a Occupy Wall Street type of ideology.
Interesting.
If you want a kind of comparison,
give it a Western lens so we can
give it a
understand
Western
better.
It's closer to something like Occupy in certain ways than it is to like a traditional Marxist-Leninist.
And then why do you think Ocalan makes this shift?
It's when you see a C in Turkish, it's a J. Yeah, just so you know, Ocalan. Yeah. Why does he make this shift? That's a good reason, I think. That's a good question. I think you've already brought it up, Jason. The fall of the Soviet Union kind of like was a that model of Marxist-Leninism, where you're like organizing to decolonize and set up a state and build socialism. That model sends not just the PKK, but like a lot of left-wing Kurdish political movements. There were other left-wing. There was a group, for example, called Alay Jazgari. Apparently, they all murdered each other up in the mountains over the question of whether the Soviet Union was state capitalist or or a socialist state. Like
Jesus.
it's like just imagine your typical DSA caucus meeting, except they all have
except nobody. It's too loud. Can you stop the clapping? It's like
obviously, and also the military defeat of the movement, I think, matters as well. By the early 1990s, it became very evident that the Turkish state had this conflict under control. The PKK, the PKK attempted, for example, to set up a kind of provisional government in the mountains, right? Mm-hmm. Completely failed. They tried to set up liberated zones so they could actually create a territorial state. Again, totally failed. And so, after those
failed because of outside forces, or it failed because of just internal struggles.
Because of the military power of the Turkish state, which is the second biggest army in NATO, right? Like setting up a liberated zone wasn't going to work, and like many PKK commanders were like, "Why are we doing this?" And Ocalan would kind of, "You fired them, yeah." So,
here's a good question. We have. I'm sorry, somebody asked, did the USSR ever give the PKK material support, armaments?
No, Syria did. But you could probably say that the Soviet Union gave weapons indirectly because they obviously armed the Syrian state. But Syria was the main sponsor of the main external sponsor of the PKK. That's why when Syria gave up its kind of protection of the PKK and forced them out of Lebanon, it was a major crisis for the PKK. So basically, the military struggle was sustained and continues to this day. But any thought that there might be a serious military victory, or at least that the PKK would get kind of into a military situation where, from a position of strength, they could negotiate with the Turkish state, was really out of the window. So I think there's it's not an overnight process, but I think it's a process that really kind of accelerates with the fall of the Soviet Union, the strengthening of the Turkish state, and ultimately with the capture of Abdullah Ocalan. And then, so when Ocalan is captured, the first real attempts at kind of a peace process begin in the early 90s for a variety of reasons. They peter out. Again, in the early 2000s, you have this kind of renewed peace process. And eventually the PKK is kind of no longer really advocating for a traditional socialist political project, but this kind of quasi-anarchistic and very vague in certain ways concept of democratic confederalism, with this kind of big emphasis of environmentalism, municipalism, and that kind of thing. So, and also multiculturalism. That's actually also another interesting evolution, is like this, the PKK is often called a Kurdish nationalist political organization, but their official ideology is actually, they reject nationalism and advocate kind of multiculturalism.
So there's more than just Kurds in the
PKK. So for example, in Syria, it's very illustrative that in Syria, where the PKK sister organization takes power, and although I would say that the SDF in Syria, is organizationally distinct from the PKK now. It's not the first. In Kurdish history, you often have, you have political parties founded, and then, a good example is the KDP, which is the ruling Kurdish party in Iraq at the moment, was founded in Iran, and the Iraqi wing of the party was initially a branch of the KDP Iran. But over time, because the interest of Kurds in Syria, in Iran, and Kurds in Iraq diverged, the Iraqi KDP became its own political party, and there's another Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is the Iranian KDP. And those groups actually in the early 80s were fighting each other, even though they started as the same organization. The SDF definitely comes out of the PKK political concept. Complex, but over the last 10 years, they've really become a distinct political organization in an organizational sense, like in terms of its structures. They aren't taking orders, for example, from the PKK commanders who are in the mountains in northern Iraq. They have their own. They have their own leadership, etc., etc. But ideologically, they draw on Öcalan's ideas, and this was a big scandal amongst Kurdish nationalists, hardcore Kurdish nationalists. They call their autonomous region not Rojava. They don't call it Rojava. They call it the autonomous region in northern Syria, right? And they officially reject nationalism in favor of this kind of multiculturalism and non-interventionism. So you have like various cultural communities have their own militias, their own sort of civil society organizations and things like that. So the PKK also kind of rejects nationalism in the traditional sense. The PKK has a long rivalry with the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iraq, which is a more traditional Kurdish nationalist political organization as well. Some of that conflict is rooted in kind of geopolitical reasons, but some of it's ideological. Within the Kurdish community, one of the big criticisms of the PKK is that they're not nationalist enough. Right, that they're kind of like too universalist. They're like, why should Kurds be kind of leading this kind of multicultural revolution in the Middle East? Kurds should look after themselves rather than trying to liberate everybody in the Middle East. So democratic confederalism, we can say is a kind of umbrella term for a kind of this idea that Kurdish liberation has to be done in a kind of an anti-nationalist way, that the solution to the Kurdish question isn't the creation of a new Kurdish state, which will just replicate the old centralism of nation states in the Middle East, except with Kurds at the top, but is to have this new form of political formation that, gives every community, every group its kind of say, and that kind of devolves power to the lowest levels of society, so that people are making making decisions themselves. And that's kind of what we see in Syria. Although I haven't been to Syria, you'd probably want to talk to Stefan more about how this works practically on the ground. But certainly it's not entirely fake, as it were, right? It's not as it's not, David Graeber, the late David Graeber, was a big booster of the Kurdish autonomous region in Syria, big booster of the kind of PKK political concept. A little bit of a rose-tinted glasses, a little bit of a kind of, how it is. Once people get on the choo-choo train for a particular political project, that political project can do no wrong. Or
the ANC.
Yeah, the ANC, Communist China, pick one, whatever you want to pick.
Yeah, whatever you want. Well, let me ask you a question more about the realpolitik, as Pascal always says in his wonderful accent. What role has the Syrian Civil War played in the altering of the balance of power for the PKK and its affiliates?
Yeah, so the Syrian Civil War has kind of been a weird one, because on one hand, it propelled the Syrian wing of the PKK, which was really a kind of, like, initially you can probably think of it like as a recruiting branch for the main PKK, like a mechanism through which Syrian Kurds were funneled into the PKK as a way to keep them away from Syria and demanding their rights in Syria. I don't need to go into it here for too much, but many Kurds in Syria were denied full citizenship or had their citizenship revoked. The Syrian state, depopulated some Kurdish villages and settled Arabs in there to create the Arab Belt, etc., to divide up the Kurdish population. So there were many issues taking place in Syria at the time. But this was there was a kind of branch that the Syrian government didn't officially tolerate, but allowed to operate in it. But with the Syrian Civil War, and that had two kind of upshots. That meant when the Civil War broke out, the only Kurdish political organization in Syria able to sort of take advantage of that vacuum of power that was emerging was the PKK. There were other Kurdish political parties, but because the PKK had been allowed to kind of semi-officially operate in those territories, they were in a position to take over. And there was a kind of tacit agreement to a certain degree between the PYD, the Syrian branch of the PKK, and the Syrian government, and they took over these territories in Syria. But once they did that, they kind of started to become their own political organization. And initially, they had in the early 2010s, there was a peace process going on in Turkey with the Kurds in Turkey. So Turkey was cooperating to a certain degree with the PYD in Syria. But for a whole variety of reasons, this all breaks down in 2015, 2016, and Turkey starts taking a far more conflictual relationship, not just within the PKK against the PKK, but against the PYD and later the SDF, its kind of successor umbrella organization in Syria. And the Americans who are backing the Kurds in Syria, would say that, well, the PKK is a terrorist organization, but the SDF is a different organization. And the Turkish government would say, it's just a branch of the PKK. You're supporting a terrorist organization. And in a way, both sides were correct, because on one hand, it's absurd to say that there's no connection between the PKK and the PYD. Mazlum Kobani, the leader of the PYD, is a veteran of the PKK struggle. He'd fought he's from Syria, but he was one of these Syrian Kurds who went and fought in Turkey for the PKK, right? So you have that. But on the other hand, the SDF is organizationally different from the PKK. They don't take orders from Kandil Mountain, which is a mountain in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is where there's a big PKK base. That's where their operations are, and it's very difficult terrain. The Turkish state has not been able to kind of drive them out of that. But we have this kind of growing conflict, and a lot of this conflict is driven less about what's happening in Syria, but more about the kind of developments in Turkey. During the first decade of Erdogan's rule, there was a kind of rapprochement with the Kurdish movement, which included kind of talk and periodic attempts to undergo a kind of peace process to get the PKK to disarm. However, in 2015, there was a nationalist backlash against this amongst the Turkish electorate. And Erdogan is a very astute politician, and so he understood which way the wind was blowing and sort of moved away from his kind of olive branches to the Kurdish political movement to more and more relying on ultra nationalists who did not want to have, at least at that time, didn't want to have peace with the PKK. So you see a resumption of kind of attacks against PKK military pilots, including in Iraq. But then, of course, you have the various military operations against the SDF in Syria. First in 2017 in Afrin, which basically the Russians were kind of protecting. They withdraw and Turkey invades, and then later on, in 2019 with Trump's withdrawal or semi-withdrawal, which opened the way for a Turkish invasion. And basically, since 2019, there's been a kind of on and off conflict. Turkey will attack infrastructure they've killed a lot of civilians. They killed some children the other day. They bombed the water purifying stations, electrical grids, etc., etc. There's this kind of there's this kind of low level warfare going on, a lot of drone usages, a lot of assassinations of not just military officials, but civilian leaders within this movement. So there's been this ongoing conflict. So the Turkish state has kind of adopted this hostile attitude towards the Kurds within Turkey, but this has spilled over, obviously, into Syria as well. Although it's important to note that the Turkish state has very good relations with the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iraq, and in effect is, Iraqi Kurdistan is now an economic colony of Turkey. You go to Iraqi Kurdistan, a lot of construction there, a lot of Turkish, you'll see it, for example, some American franchise restaurants there, but usually you just see Turkish franchise restaurants there. And in fact, Iraqi Kurdistan just looks like Turkey now. It's like,
so
shops.
Were those maybe higher class Kurds that were able to make that transition?
No, well, that was the Iraqi Kurds. For Turkey, the Iraqi Kurdish the KDP had, the PKK had this idea for unified independent Kurdistan, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, the KDP of Iraq doesn't like that. So they were often cooperated with the Turkish government, and that cooperation has deepened over the years. And the Iraqi Kurdish political leadership, in order, although the Turkish state kind of consented in the 90s to the creation of a Kurdish autonomous region, largely because, after the failure of the uprisings against Saddam Hussein in 1991, the Turkish state was faced with a choice. It was like, well, either we're going to keep these Kurds in Iraq or they're all going to flee to Turkey.
Mhm.
And the Turkish government saying to itself, yeah, we already have this Kurdish uprising in Turkey.
Mhm.
If we add 2 million Iraqi Kurdish refugees to that, it's going to make it worse. So the Turkish government, in cooperation with the United States, they created this Kurdish autonomous region. And since the second Iraq War in 2003, the Iraqi Kurdish political leadership was like, okay, the Turks might be a bit racist against us, but we have a plan. And our plan is to give them all the contracts in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Mm.
Because if we give them all the contracts in Iraqi Kurdistan, then suddenly they're going to have big economic interests in Iraqi Kurdistan. So you have, so they kind of basically are able to kind of get they're basically able to like have a work. They're basically able to have a working relationship with Turkey based on this kind of economic interest. And one of the things is, especially with the AKP, with Erdogan, the old political elite before Erdogan in Turkey were like actually one of the big obstacles they had in solving the Kurdish question is that they were often quite racist and anti-Kurdish. So, for example, the former Turkish, like before Erdogan became president, when he was prime minister, there was a president who had been a Supreme Court judge called Sezer, who refused to meet Jalal Talabani, who was the Iraqi president at the time, because he was a Kurd, right?
Wow.
So you had this old Kemalist elite which really looked down on Kurds, right? The Erdogan and his Islamists are a lot better at kind of like, they're not so ideologically hostile to Kurds, at least in the same way that the old Kemalist elite were. So they were perfectly okay with perfectly okay with working with the Iraqi Kurds. Gradually. In fact, I spoke to the former Turkish foreign minister one time, and he said, one of the things that they were doing with Iraqi Kurdistan was like they wanted to have good relations with Iraqi Kurdistan, but they had to kind of ease the Turkish public into that, because they understood the kind of racism against Kurds. So like cooperating with the Iraqi Kurds would be not seen in a positive light by many members of the Turkish public. But that's a kind of a digression here. So Iraqi Kurdistan is a little bit different. But you see after 2015, this intensification of the conflict with the PKK, and then later on with the SDF in Syria, and that continues to this day, actually. But especially after the presidential election in Turkey, Erdogan, returning, winning that election in 2023, ongoing repression of Kurdish political forces in Turkey, including the HDP, the imprisonment of Salahdin Demirtas, who was, the co-leader of that political party, the arrest of thousands of Kurdish political activists in Turkey. You have Kurdish mayors and local councils, municipal government. Many of their elections are rendered null and void, and the government instead appoints custodians, like city managers, as it were. To use a U.S. analogy, when you have a city council, the city gets bankrupt, and then the governor appoints someone to run the city instead of having the democratically elected city. You have a lot of that. So you have this big repression against Kurds within Turkey, Kurds outside of Turkey as well, especially in Syria. But since 2023, a lot of weird stuff has been happening. This huge repression continues to go on. It was a couple of weeks ago they removed, a veteran Kurdish politician from the mayor, being mayor of Mardin, a predominantly Kurdish town. The mayor of Van, another Kurdish town, is removed. So you have this repression going on. But in the background, there's all this discussion about like a potential restarting the peace process that had petered out. And what is really interesting is Erdogan's, whereas Erdogan and the AKP had been closely associated with previous peace attempts, instead of Erdogan taking the lead on this, it is Devlet Bahçeli who takes the lead of that. Who is Devlet Bahçeli? He is the leader of the Nationalist Action Party, which is the political wing of the Grey Wolf movement. So the Turkish ultranationalists suddenly start making noises about this new peace movement. And then Öcalan, they talk about Öcalan giving a statement. And then, of course, Öcalan eventually, through his lawyers, through some Kurdish politicians, delivers this statement where he basically kind of calls on the PKK to have a congress and to move towards disarming itself, right? But since then, what have we seen? Nobody knows what's going on. The Turkish government is continuing military operations against the PKK targets inside Iraq. Some members of one of the leaders of the PKK, for example, recently made a statement saying, well, some of our fighters are not convinced about this. Can we be convinced about it? So although Öcalan has given the statement, he's called on the PKK to hold a congress, dissolve itself, disarm. He has made virtually no political demands. So nothing about saying, well, we're going to be negotiating about autonomy or confederalism or what have you. Basically just calling on the PKK to disband and work within the Turkish political system. So we have this kind of statement, but there doesn't seem to be a kind of mechanism for this. Like, how do you disarm and surrender when you're still getting attacked by the Turkish state? The Turkish state has said, no, we're not going to stop attacking, or at least recently it said it's not going to stop attacking. So nobody knows really where this is going. But hot on the heels of that statement is the agreement between Mazlum Kobadi, who is the leader of the SDF in Syria, and the new Al-Qaeda-led government in Syria. Possibly a direct outcome of that Öcalan statement. Turkey has been making a lot of noises about invading Syria again if they don't if the SDF doesn't surrender and integrate into the new government. And the SDF basically has said, okay, we'll do all that. They've signed some papers, but you know what it is. You know what it's like. They've signed some papers, but nothing's actually changed on the ground. So everything is kind of up in the air. There are kind of contradictory sides. On one hand, there's all this talk about a peace process, right? But at the same time, you still have Turkish military operations taking place against PKK targets in Iraq, and you still have the Turkish government perhaps threatening to invade Syria. And to make things more complicated, now Turkey's in a new huge political crisis because they arrested the mayor of Istanbul, who is from an opposition political party, a non-Kurdish oppositional political party. And, they've done all kinds of things to this guy, İmamoğlu, right? İmamoğlu basically beat the ruling party's candidate in the Istanbul mayoral race in 2019, I want to say. And I don't think Erdogan's ever forgiven him for that. And now they're just fully going after him, right? No, not even. Like under Turkish law, you have to have a university diploma to run and be the president. They basically forced Istanbul University to cancel his degree, so he can't run.
Jesus.
And then they arrested him. And what's interesting is they arrested him for corruption on one hand, right? Which maybe he was corrupt. I don't know. It sounds a I mean, everybody in Turkey is corrupt, so whatever. But everybody has a taste. He's certainly not more corrupt than anyone else, and probably a lot less corrupt than most of them. But the interesting thing, he's also been charged with terrorism based on having relations with the PKK, even though the Turkish state at this very moment is trying to engage in, is claiming to be engaging in a peace process with the PKK. They're charging the mayor of Istanbul on very spurious, like completely absurd grounds that he's a terrorist and has relations with the PKK. So we have this kind of chaotic situation where there's a lot of talk of a peace process, but at the same time, the facts on the ground don't seem to bear that out.
Well, what happens if the PKK ceases to exist?
Well, like the PKK,
is there any alternatives for resistance or self-governance?
Well, you have political parties in Turkey. You have Dem Party, which is a party that it's under enormous pressure by the Turkish government, but still exists as a legal organization. And also the PKK has tried to rebrand itself in the past. There was a period when they called themselves Kongregel. Then it was the KKK, which probably the worst rebrand of all time. So when they say dissolve the PKK, my suspicion is that it's just going to be they're going to change the name, right?
Is that why would they need to change the branding?
PKK is not a popular organization, and yeah, why they need to change? They ain't fooling anybody, right? But I mean, maybe they will completely disband, but the really question is, it's like you have these fighters up in the mountains, right? Well, if they can't surrender, if there's no, what's the process for demobilizing them, right? So,
and what are they going to do once they're done?
Yeah, what are they going to do, right? There was actually a case, about 15 years ago, maybe it was 15 years ago, where some fighters from the Mahmur refugee camp came back to Turkey. They were kind of welcomed back, but that sort of was part of the reason there was a huge Turkish nationalist backlash, because it was seen as a victory for the Kurds that they were, like that these people had been brought back. So I really don't know where this is going, right? And because for a peace process, even one where the PKK is getting the raw end of the deal, right? There needs to be a mechanism for this organization to disband itself. And also, what does disbanding itself mean? Like I said, the PKK has tried to rebrand itself in the past. Does Öcalan want them to rebrand themselves and return to Turkey? Or does he want them to, completely dissolve their organizational structures, do something else? It's really, difficult to know where this is going, because the Turkish state is kind of, talking about process, but acting as if there's no process with these arrests and continued military operations. As for the PKK, like I said, and like you asked, what does it mean to disband yourself as an organization? Will there be a new organization for all these people to go into, or will they go into, let's say, other existing organizations in Turkey like Dem Party? I don't know.
How do you feel about the whole situation? Like, honestly.
How do I feel about it? I mean, I hope it works, right? Like, I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, it would be nice to have some kind of peaceful resolution to the Kurdish question in Turkey. I'm just very skeptical that this process, at least the way that it's configured at the moment, is actually a peace process, right?
Because you don't trust Turkey.
It's not even about not trusting Turkey. It's just like they aren't doing anything practically to I mean, for example, if the Turkish state said, we're going to give you a 6-month ceasefire to demobilize yourself, to hold a Congress, right? And I should note, the Turkish government vetted Öcalan's message, right? Like, the Turkish government allowed that message to come out where he calls on the PKK to hold a Congress and disband. If the Turkish government said, you have 6 months to do this in, hold your Congress, and we'll leave you do it, then I would say, okay, still we don't know where it's going, but I kind of get what's happening. There's going to be a 6 month. The PKK the ball's in the PKK's court now. They got 6 months to resolve this. But the military operations are still going on. So it's a lot of words, right? But until we actually see some concrete actions, the fact that there was a peace treaty between, the Kurds in Syria and Damascus, on one hand, we might see that as being the work of Turkey or like as a result of Turkish pressure. But, equally, what could be behind that is the U.S. wants that to happen. Mm-hmm. And also with these massacres taking place on the coast in Syria, the attacks on the Alawite community in Syria, Jolani is, needs a win, a political win, and making peace with the Kurds and for having some kind of roadmap for peace, some kind of roadmap for peace, became a kind of, like a political win within the context of the Syrian government not looking very good because of these massacres that are taking place. So there's a lot of things we don't know at the moment. There's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that we don't know at the moment. What America is going to do is a very difficult thing to know. I suspect Trump wants to withdraw, but I suspect Trump doesn't want to have what happened last time, because in 2019 he withdrew, right? He obviously annoyed the neocons, but he also annoyed elements of the evangelical base, because the evangelical base doesn't like Turkey. There's a lot of reasons for this, but there was a famous case with this guy called Andrew Brunson, who was a missionary who was put on trial in Turkey. Trump got him out, basically. But Erdogan is like one of the bad guys in the kind of universe. So within the Trump administration, Trump apparently has good relations with Erdogan. He's very impressed that Erdogan has these big rallies. John Bolton talks about in his memoirs of the Trump administration. But also there's a lot of people in the administration, not just the neocons, but also the kind of Christian nationalist types who don't like Erdogan as well. So I think Trump probably wants to withdraw, but he doesn't want it to look like what happened in 2019, where it just looked like, oh shit, America's withdrawing and now Turkey's coming in and killing our former allies. And, many people were pretty upset about that. He doesn't want it to look like a failure like Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal. So I think he's trying to lay the grounds for that withdrawal. But we'll see where it goes from there, because there's a lot, because, Erdogan is coming into is in a position of strength at the moment. Syria was a big win for them. They got rid of Assad. Turkey was the big winner. Turkey is likely to become the kind of, Syria is likely to become Iraqi Kurdistan on steroids, another economic colony for Turkey. Turkey is like in a strong position in its negotiations with Armenia, because Azerbaijan has been pressuring them. With the stuff that's going on in the US, the EU is looking towards kind of revamping its relationship with Turkey, because Turkey has a large armed forces. And obviously for any kind of European defense plan, Turkey would be a critical player in there. So Erdogan's in a position of strength. But suddenly there's these huge protests taking place in Turkey as well. So where is this all going, right? There were so many moving parts. But I think the key takeaway, I would say, about anyone wanting to understand what's going on with this peace process and Öcalan's statement is that there is talk of this peace process, but the facts on the ground are not bearing that out at the moment. Maybe things will change in the future. I would say that the rhetoric of Turkey towards the Syrian Kurds is a little bit cooled. The temperature has cooled down a little bit since this statement. I saw the Turkish foreign minister, a clip of the Turkish foreign minister saying like, well, they better do it. They better, the Syrian Kurds better kind of integrate into the Syrian government. Otherwise it's going to be trouble. But it seems there's a kind of like the pressure is off there, but it still leaves us with the PKK fighters, many of whom were in this very mountainous region in Iraq, very difficult territory to control. Yeah, what the heck's going to happen with that? There's no ceasefire. The conflict continues. So we will have to see. If the Turkish government declares a ceasefire, then I think we might be entering a serious, moment of a peace process. But at present, I'm not seeing it.
Yes. Well, let me ask you this in closing, and I want to first of all thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and give us this kind of wonderful history lecture on the history of the PKK and the region. What lessons do you think can be learned from the PKK's successes and then, of course, their failures?
I mean, I don't know if there are lessons to be
Really?
learned. I mean, lessons for who? I mean, the situation where the PKK, when the PKK was founded, the Kurdish population was predominantly made up of sharecroppers and like deeply oppressed peasants ruled over by tribal elites who had the backing of the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure a political organization that developed in that particular context is that relevant to, let's say, whatever's going to happen in the United States. What I would say is, though, the rejection of nationalism by the PKK is interesting. The idea, one of the critique the PKK has of over centralization and like this kind of one flag, one nation, one language, and we'll oppress you if you don't speak Turkish or something like. I mean, those are legitimate critiques, and I think one of the big problems in the Middle East has been nation building projects is often left to you have this enormously diverse region in terms of religion and language and culture, and when nation states were created, one of the big drives has been to eradicate differences, eradicate all these differences in terms of language and culture, to force people to speak Arabic or Turkish, to Islamize certain populations, to create a kind of forced cultural unity, because that's seen as the only way that you can keep a state together. Whereas I think, at least on an abstract level, the idea that, hey, maybe instead of trying to wipe out minorities in a country or wipe out cultural diversity, that we find some way for all these different sects and ethnic communities to live together. I think that's kind of a worthy cause. I think the emphasis that the PKK political complex has had on women's emancipation is important in the Middle East, at least in the sense that it we have this mythology that the middle women in the Middle East are just oppressed, without any agency. Well, women within the Kurdish political movement have had political agency, have had some. I mean,
Stefan talked about it the first time we came on here.
Huh?
Stefan talked about it the first time.
Yeah, I mean, what's the best? American liberals are very squeamish about guns because gun rights is right coded in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? What's been the most successful way for women's emancipation in the Middle East? Giving women guns, right? You give a woman a gun, it's a lot more difficult to do a domestic violence on her, isn't it?
It is a lot more, isn't it? Yeah. Sarah Bajalan has a gun. Djene Bajalan keeps his mouth shut.
Exactly. For example, if we look at the PKK has a significant number of women fighters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, most of those women fighters, or at least some of those men, from the research that I've read, they're not going up to the mountains because they have this, because they're like Kurdish nationalists, like that. They, it's all about I want to live in a country with a Kurdish passport, right? I'm sure there's that nationalist kind of impulse amongst them, but they're going there because the PKK is offering kind of social emancipation. It's like, okay, I can get married off to this old dude in my village, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll just go up to the mountains and get a gun, and then I don't have to be married off to this like creepy old 70-year-old, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like if we want to say like some observations from the PKK that are interesting is that the type of organization the PKK is, flawed as it is, calls into question the idea that the kind of natural politics of the Middle East is this kind of reactionary Islamism, right? That there are other political possibilities, right? There are other movements out there. But the PKK itself is in many ways a political party born out of defeat, right? And what I mean by defeat is that, it's the defeat of not just socialism, but, liberalism, right? Like a liberal political order that could accommodate, the Kurdish community within, let's say, Turkey, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I always say is like, if in 1925, instead of suppressing Kurdish language and culture, they just set up like the Kurdish language department at the University of Istanbul and employed a bunch of Kurdish intellectuals, you wouldn't have a Kurdish question today, right? Eric Hobsbawm has this saying about nationalism. He says, it's not nations that make nation states and nationalism. It's nationalisms and nation states that make nations, right? And I always think that, yes, but Hobsbawm forgot to add, sometimes nationalisms and nation states make the wrong nation. And what I mean by that is sometimes they kind of treat a certain community like shit, so that even if that community didn't really have a strong national identity before, their national identity is kind of created within the context of being oppressed by someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, in many ways, who is the father of the Iraqi Kurdish nation? It's Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein, imposed like this huge genocide on the Kurds in Iraq, which helped consolidate their national identity. And not that Kurdish nationalism didn't exist before, right? But, helped consolidate the Kurdish nationalism in Iraq. In Turkey, again, the PKK is a response to the kind of failure of Turkish democracy to take into account Kurdish political demands, and the failure of the Turkish socialist movement to overthrow the nation state and establish a kind of socialist state as well. So, the PKK is ultimately an expression of failure, political failure in the Middle East, right? If that makes sense to you.
Well, it does. And our good friend Derek Varn sent me a message and said he will be in the champagne room. So
champagne showers, baby.
Thank you guys for checking everything out. If you're new here or if you're a returning subscriber, don't forget to hit like. Definitely hit the notification bell, subscribe if you haven't. If you're listening on Apple and you want to have access to the champagne room, you can sign up on Apple and you can have access on the champagne room. About 40% of the audio listeners are Apple. I'm sorry, 48% of the listeners of this show are Apple listeners. So
really?
Yeah. Apple Podcasts. I don't know where our rank is anymore because I didn't pay for that service that shows you where your rank is. But when Ben and I were looking at the top 200 podcasts just overall in America, we were not on there. Not at all.
We failed.
Not even close. But within certain categories, we're pretty high on the list. Pretty high. So we'll be going to the champagne room. If you're a patron, the link is already up. If you want to become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year, you can have access to the patron-only champagne room. Join us for movie nights, get special patron-only merch, and more. Patreon.com/BitterLakePresents. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there is a link in the description. Thank you, Djene Bajalan. I will see you in the champagne room. I'll send you the link. And
did
I send it to you? Did I send it to you already?
No, you haven't sent it to me.
Yeah, I'm going to send it to you now.
Send it to me now, baby.
All right. We are out.